Evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's class in the Tira. Tonight we have two very special guests. We have Dr. Ian Thompson and Chantelle Standefer, all the way from the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma State, United States of America. I asked them to do this lecture because for a while I've been aware of the amazing generosity of the Choctaw Nation to our own nation, so the Irish people who are suffering from starvation during the Irish famine. And they made that donation in 1847, and it saved the lives of a lot of Irish people, and that's well documented. To mark that generous donation, the Irish people and the people of Cork and Middleton erected a Kindred Spirits monument down in Middleton in 2015. And it's quite a spectacular monument that kind of marks that generous gift. I have no idea what's contained in this lecture, and when I suggested to Chantelle the amazing parallels between the plight of the Native American people and our own Irish people here, I got accused of peeking ahead. So, Fáilte wrote to Ian and Chantelle a very warm Irish welcome. We're really looking forward to this lecture, and I'll hand it over to you both.
Well, I'll go ahead and introduce myself briefly and say Konasatatu, or in Choctaw we say Chumachukma. How are you? I hope that you're all doing well, and very glad for the opportunity to meet with you all and share some of Choctaw culture and our shared experience with the Irish people, and looking forward. And Dr. Thompson is gonna start us off.
Alito, Choctaw Manompa Oakland Makoshachi Panchali. So Chifoyadi Ian Thompson, Choctaw Okla Micha Eilish Okla Mintali. Yamaknetok Satik Chiemi Toklo cut Antlers Oklahoma Bilinka Ilashwa, Atako Oklahoma Chata Okla Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Toksalali. Himano Naholoim and Ompa Non Petroshola. Hello everyone, I greet you in the beautiful Choctaw language. My name's Ian Thompson. I'm of Choctaw and Euro-American descent, and nowadays I reside with my wife Amy near Antlers, Oklahoma, and I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Choctaw Nation. So, of course, I introduced myself in the Choctaw language, and I'd like to teach you guys just one Choctaw word to start my presentation, and that is halito. Halito, it sounds a little bit like the English word hello, but it has a completely different origin. And this origin sort of captures part of where Choctaw people come from. Halito comes from Holetopa Chia Hoki, and in our language that means you are truly beloved. That's the greeting, the traditional greeting in our language. And it comes from a place of respect, which I think both we and the Irish folks share. What I'd like to do now is I've put together some slides that will take us to places that we can't see just in our own individual houses. And let's see, we'll attempt to share screen. Can you see that, Liam?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. So we're Indigenous people, and that's one of the things that we have in connection with the Irish people. We're deeply tied to the land. We have oral stories that talk about at a place called Non-Awaya, which means a place of growth. That's located in the southeastern United States. For those of you that are familiar with American geography, it's in the east central part of the state of Mississippi. We also have stories that talk about our deep connection with the Chickasaws. They're our sister tribe. They speak a language that's almost identical to ours, and they have a lot of similar culture. One of the things that is interesting in our history, you know, we have our own ways of knowing, just I'm sure like traditional Irish folks do. And we can connect that with archaeology, as I believe some of the folks in Ireland do too. So when we connect our oral stories with archaeology, it puts a calendar to some of the deep history that we have. For example, Choctaw society was kind of based on corn agriculture at the time of European contact. We have oral stories that talk about how we got corn. Well, that happened about 1100 AD. We adopted archery about 750 AD. According to our oral traditions, we developed pottery from a unique set of circumstances. Archaeology tells us that happened in about 1500 BC. Ultimately, we have oral stories that talk about giant animals that lived in our homeland. They lived in herds and they tore down the trees to create the Black Belt Prairie, which you can still see today. Archaeology tells us that, in fact, our homeland was inhabited by those giant animals, and in fact, our ancestors did live with them. They went extinct about nearly 12,000 years ago. So these oral histories combined with archaeology put Choctaw people on the land in our present day homeland at least 12,000 years ago. It's difficult to compress 12,000 plus years of history, but I'm just going to show you a few pictures that I hope encapsulates our identity as Indigenous people and a little bit of where we come from. So our ancestors not only lived with giant animals like the mastodon and the woolly mammoth whose skeleton. This was long before the advent of the bow and arrow. And this is the weapon that they use. It's called an atlatl. People on every habitable continent of the planet use the same weapon at some point in time, including Europe. This highlights a certain level of ingeniousness. Basically, the weapon is a stick with a spur on the end that adds length and leverage to your arm. That spur goes into the base of a big spear that's kind of like an arrow. And with that, you can throw the dart or the spear with 40 times more force than you could with just your hand. So this weapon, it's made out of a stick, a piece of cane, some feathers, and a stone. And it has better penetrating power up close than a bullet from a 30-06 rifle. This is how our ancestors hunted those giant animals. And like I say, people on other continents use this weapon as well. For more than 10,000 years, our ancestors lived just by their ability to manage the land. They didn't pristine wilderness, they carefully managed it for food and other resources. The picture up at the right, that's one of our traditional foods. It's called kantak in the Choctaw language. It looks kind of like an alien baby. It's this really large, kind of unpalatable root. It's located on the base of a really thorny plant. But if you dig that root and process it in the right way, in a traditional earth oven, which is pictured at the lower right there, you can make bread out of it. You can make fried cakes out of it, stew, a lot of different things. This was a traditional food for us in the wintertime when other resources were scarce. The points at the left there, those represent different time periods in our history. That's sort of the evolution of our hunting technology. Fast forward to around 1700 BC, and our ancestors with other ancestral folks in the southeastern United States built what's known as Poverty Point. Today it's recognized as a World Heritage Site. This was a settlement that was built entirely without the aid of agriculture, but it was a large and prosperous settlement. The left-hand side, which you see there, it's a little bit difficult to discern from the picture, but that's an earth mound built one basket load of dirt at a time. It looks kind of amorphously shaped from the ground, but when you get up in the air, it's actually an effigy of a bird flying away from the settlement. That earth mound has the equivalent amount of dirt in it to 17,000 dump truck loads. And it was built within a 3-month period, all by our ancestral society that did not even have agriculture. So this speaks to the power of the land and the power of knowing how to draw a living from it over thousands of years. This is the basis of Choctaw traditional culture. We did adopt agriculture a little more than 2,000 years ago. Local indigenous plants, this one's lamb's quarter. We started creating new types of settlements that took the best advantage of fertile agricultural soils for corn. I'm getting a message that my connection's unstable, so if I freeze up, I apologize.
No, you're okay there, Ian. You're okay, dropping great. Out. You're dropping out occasionally, but just for a couple of seconds, so you're fine. No problem.
Okay, wonderful. So our culture and our society is based on this unique experience with the land that goes back at least 12,000 years. Just like every other group of indigenous people around the world are based their society, their culture is based on their own unique experience with the land and other people. Contact. A lot of folks don't realize it, but we had fine textiles made from native plants and also animal fibers, also bird feathers. That's what's represented here, along with leather articles. This is our homeland, and this is what it looks like from a Choctaw perspective. You know, these are all Choctaw place names. The different color shaded areas represent different ecozones that we managed and helped to create within our homeland. These ecozones wouldn't have existed if it weren't for very careful land management over thousands of years. The main Choctaw villages were located in a mixed forest like this. I'm not sure if you guys have been to the southeastern United States, but if you don't manage the forest there, it just grows up like a jungle. Light doesn't penetrate very well. You can't walk through it. On the other hand, this picture is of a carefully managed forest. It's mostly managed by burning it regularly. It creates a completely different type of ecosystem that sustains human life. Our home area has prairies in it. Traditionally, in the past, when we managed it, some of these prairies stretched for as far as the eye could see, from horizon to horizon. They provided lots of important resources for our culture. In the Choctaw language, one of the terms for stream is Okena. This means water road. These were important avenues of transportation. There were also trails that linked our homeland with areas down on the Gulf Coast all the way up into central Canada. Thousands of miles of footpaths that connected us with other communities that spoke more than 1,000 different languages in what's now the United States. The southern part of Choctaw country is longleaf pine forest. Basically, this is a forest made of trees, pine trees that grow in a tall grass prairie. 200 years ago, some of the trees in that forest stood 150 feet to the first branch, giant old growth timber. This ecosystem had the second highest ecological diversity outside of the tropics. And finally, going all the way south, you end up in estuary environments like Mobile Bay, Biloxi Bay, going out onto the Gulf of Mexico. This environment itself provided up to 1 million pounds of fish per square mile. Our traditional society is based on this landscape. We saw a duality in the seasons that I'll talk about a little bit later, and a lot of our traditional culture is based on balance and duality. One part of that is the role between men and women traditionally. Ohoyo, women in Choctaw societies are recognized as the life givers. Their power is greater than men. They have the power innate in their own body to create life. And that's far more powerful than the destructive capability that men have. Recognizing this, our society was based on women and the female line. The family, the clan, went down through the mother's side. When a couple got married, they usually lived with the wife's family. If a mother died and the father still lived, the child went to live with the woman's relatives rather than the father's, because that child was part of the mother's clan. In our society, traditionally, women were the homeowners. When a lady decided to divorce her husband, she just set his weapons outside the house and that was it. That's all he owned. She kept the house and everything else. Women were also agricultural producers. Most of our food traditionally came from agriculture, and women were responsible for that and also responsible for the products that came from agriculture. Women also did domestic activities. It wasn't just drudgery, but they were many times fantastic traditional artists. They made fantastic arts and ceramics, basketry, textiles, possibly hide work that were used for daily activities, but they went so much more beyond just survival. They were a high level of art. As I said, hatak, men's responsibilities balanced those of women, whereas women were in charge of agricultural produce, men were in charge of hunting. Whereas women were the givers of life, men were the takers of life. That wasn't done lightly, but when it was necessary to protect the community, men would go out and take the lives of others and lay their own lives down. Men were responsible for interacting with other groups, doing some of the heaviest work in the agricultural fields and at home, serving as the historians, and also playing stickball. It's the Choctaw national sport. It helped prepare men and condition them for the rigors of hunting and also warfare. The society was balanced in terms of the roles of men and women. Similarly, the year was balanced in terms of the cold season and the warm season. The Choctaw New Year actually begins with the fall equinox, because our oral traditions say that this is the time of year when Choctaw society was created. This is the season when the fields were harvested, the community moved into winter residences. This is the season for the hunt. Men would be fasting to prepare for this. This is when women and girls would collect different foods and process them for storage for the season. This is what a Choctaw winter house looks like. One name for it is alaksha. This is the type of house that we lived in during the winter hunts. It's made out of bark. You can see two of our different hunting techniques in the adjacent images. The cold season was based with the warm season. At this time, the community would go out to individual farmsteads, prepare agricultural fields. Our villages traditionally had 3 different agricultural fields that were planted during different parts of the warm season. They had different specific types of food in them and different roles. They represented a pretty sustainable way to live. As the season got hot, the men would go out and fish, collect shellfish. Depending on the village, the women sometimes helped them. At some Choctaw villages, fish and shellfish actually made up the bulk of the diet, although at most it was agriculture. I don't have very much time to talk, but this is a traditional Choctaw crop that represents our philosophy about the land and continuity. It's called Three Sisters. Basically, there's a corn plant that provides a stalk for the beans to run on. The beans have bacteria that fix nitrogen in the soil, which the corn takes out. And between the rows of corn and beans, you plant winter squash. And they have these broad leaves that shade the soil, keep it from drying out and keep it from growing weeds. So the plants support each other. And then when you eat the individual food from each of these plants, it lacks certain nutrition. When you eat it together, however, it provides a complete nutrition. These are what Choctaw summer houses look like. You know, it's pretty hot and humid in Mississippi, so they were designed to keep the rain off, but to allow the breeze to blow through. Our area has an abundance of wild fruit that come available. The crops are planted right after the fruit starts to become available so that the birds and squirrels and things like that will focus on the fruit rather than damaging the crops. Young folks were trained in the ways of the older folks by participation. This is a picture of a Choctaw boy hunting birds with a river cane blowgun. Some of our fishing techniques were pretty elaborate. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but I'll be glad to talk about them in the questions later. This is the Choctaw national game, kapocha, stickball. It's the grandfather of American sports. There are elements of Choctaw stickball in games such as lacrosse, basketball, football. Some of our stickball games would have 800 players on the field at one time. And like I was mentioning, this conditioned men for the rigors of hunting and warfare. Choctaw women also had their own stickball games played separately from the men. Just a few scenes of the fall harvest here. Our harvests were substantial. At the time of European contact, we exported food to not only other tribes, but European colonies. Colonization for us began in 1500 with the arrival of the Spanish. At first, the first Spanish army that came into Choctaw country was easily defeated. However, they brought diseases with them, and the last 4 members of that Spanish party, the natives took pity on them, so they brought them into their houses, even though these were people who had just been trying to kill them. The native people took them into their houses and cared for them. And while this happened, the Europeans transferred a fever to the native community, and it quickly killed half the people in that community. And from that point on, wave after wave of disease hit the Choctaw homeland for about 200 years. It's estimated it killed about 90% of the people living there. Across the Americas, it killed about 90 million people, one of the most horrific losses of life in human history. Once weakened by disease, then European powers were more effective in colonizing us, ultimately. The picture there is of Hernando de Soto. We fought a battle against him. Ultimately, the Choctaws crippled his army, but it cost the life of every Choctaw man. And when the men fell, the women picked up the men's weapons and just kept right on fighting the Spanish. Technically, the Spanish won, but they said that they couldn't have their plans to colonize the New World succeed because Choctaws loved their freedom so much that we would die rather than giving it up. So it thwarted the Spanish plans, not to mention the 700 arrow wounds. Eventually, our land was all ceded to the United States through a series of treaties that started out in terms of friendship, and eventually they turned into demands for Choctaw land. And eventually they devolved into the United States threatening the utter destruction of the Choctaw people unless we gave up the last of our lands. And I'll point out that the Choctaw people never fought against the United States. We'd always been allies, but that's ultimately how we were treated. The shaded area in the right there, that's our homeland, color-coded according to the different treaties that gave it up. On the left, the red area there, part of the red area is where the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma is located now. Giving up our land precipitated the trail of tears and death. This began in 1830. 2/3 of the tribe were moved from our homeland to what's now Oklahoma between 1830 and 1833. Other groups moved in the 1840s, 50s, and clear up to 1903. 1/3 of our tribe died en route for various reasons. This is the context of the gift to the Irish people. You know, Choctaws were in the middle of this removal when our ancestors made that donation. So we often think about colonization in terms of land. We think about it in terms of human lives. Sometimes what's not thought about is the loss of knowledge. Again, our community is based on at least 12,000 years of experience with the land. So this is a picture of Olsey. He's a Choctaw man photographed in our homeland in the 1800s. Those are longleaf pine trees. That's what that forest used to look like. And it had been managed for thousands of years by our community. Within a short time,
Hi everybody, we just lost Ian there for a couple of seconds. He's, as well as having poor broadband across rural Ireland, Ian is living in an area in Oklahoma where they've also got poor broadband. So if you'll bear with us, I'm sure he'll be back shortly, and sorry for the interruption.
Liam, if you like, I can go ahead and pick up kind of where Ian left off.
That sounds great. Thanks a million, Chantelle.
So I'm gonna pick up, kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about, Ian covered 12,000 years in 20 minutes, so I'm gonna see if I can do 500. Traditionally, Choctaw people, when we get in large groups, we tend to be quiet, but if you get us going about something we love and are passionate about, you know, I'll try to keep this short, is what I'm saying.
Great.
So as Ian mentioned, one of the first Europeans encounters we had was with DeSoto and his men. As a language instructor, you know, picking up how some of our language developed, this is where we coined our term for people of Caucasian descent, and the term is Naholo. Originally, when we encountered DeSoto, you know, we treated our guests with respect, so we called them Nana in Holo, which is something that is respected or revered. As DeSoto and his men made themselves known to the Choctaw, they adjusted that a little bit because DeSoto's intent was, you know, gold and self-glory, which is very countercultural to Choctaw culture. And Choctaw culture, we value community and respect among ourselves. So as we got to know DeSoto, they changed it a little bit to Nana in Holo, which roughly translates as greedy people. This is a story of why first impressions are really important, because even after DeSoto moved on, this story persisted among the Choctaw. And when we encountered the next round of people coming in, we were like, oh yeah, we remember you guys. And so we actually still use the term Naholo to denote people of Caucasian descent. So yeah, y'all can blame DeSoto for that. As the years after DeSoto came, about 150 years later, more traders started coming in. They were primarily French, and so we had a lot of allies with the French. You can see evidence of that today, and a lot of our Choctaw last names have French origins. So there was trading and intermarrying. We originally lived in the Mississippi area and controlled a fair section of the Mississippi River, which is the largest river in North America. So we were heavily involved in trade, since water has always been a major part of moving trade goods. So when Europeans came in, they wanted to come get acquainted with us. As Ian mentioned, there was a series of treaties. So shortly after the United States government was formed, the Constitution was ratified. The nation began looking at, all right, we need to start officially interacting with the native people here. And so in 1786, we had the Treaty of Hopewell, and what this did is define the boundaries of the Choctaw Nation. And what we didn't know is what they were defining of what they had their eye on to take later. And so after that Treaty of Hopewell, there was a series of treaties that further, constricted the official Choctaw land base. As we were creating these treaties, another part of our culture is that we adapt, and we're going to make the best with the opportunities and tools that are available to us. And so one thing that our leaders started writing into these treaties is we want formal education. As Ian mentioned earlier, obviously the elders would have passed information down to youth, and we had our indigenous ways of education, but we knew in this new situation that we were encountering, we needed to know, what was going on in the inside. And so they had the United States as part of us giving up land. In return, they would provide money for education for our Choctaw youth. This led to the invitation of missionaries to Choctaw homelands for the purpose of setting up schools. Obviously, the missionaries were coming to share and convert people, but the Choctaw said, well, you can come, but you have to build schools. This led to a written version. So Choctaw did not have a written component until around the 1820s. It was a purely oral tradition. But this led to the creation to a written version, because they obviously wanted to translate the Bible and have that so they could give people. So we do have a copy of the scriptures in Choctaw. Also led to the creation of a dictionary. This is from the 1820s. We do have a new one we have recently put out, and the production of hymns. One thing to note about these hymns is that they originated in Choctaw. We may use some English tunes, but they're not translations of English songs. They're Choctaw perspective of relationship with God. A lot of Choctaws did what the missionaries would say converted. What the elders have told me is that when the missionaries came, a lot of the beliefs and core values of Christianity were already a part of Choctaw culture. So the care of others, you know, service to your community and being generous. And so a lot of elders said, no, that's not converting. That's just being who we've always been. But we did pick up, you know, the translation of the Bible and Choctaw hymns. And the schools, when they were run by Choctaw leadership and the missionaries, actually taught in Choctaw and English. So students became literate in both languages and fluent in both. As time went on, there was a push. There were more settlers coming in, and you know, usually coming in from the east. And so there was a push to move all the Native Americans that lived east of the Mississippi River out so that they could make room for European settlers. Plus the land that we were living on, we'd been tending, as Ian mentioned, for thousands of years. So it was prime crop growing land due to the management of Native Americans. And so it was very appealing. And so they wanted us to move along. So the Indian Removal Act was passed in May of 1830. In an amazing feat of government efficiency that we don't see very often, they decided to move us out in September of 1830. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed between the Choctaw and the United States government. And this detailed the Choctaws ceding over all of their land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in Indian Territory, which eventually became Oklahoma, which is where we are today. Some unique aspects of this treaty that the Choctaws negotiated is that they wanted options for the members. As mentioned before, there had been intermarriage, so there were a lot of people like me of mixed heritage, both European and Choctaw ancestry. And so one of the things the Choctaw leaders emphasized is that those of us that want to move, we want to maintain our tribal sovereignty, we want to maintain our tribal life ways, our tribal governments. And so they were willing to move to a different place to try to maintain that. If people chose to stay, then the United States government had to recognize them with all the rights and privileges of citizens. So they would become citizens of the United States. So they would be able to vote and participate in running for office and owning land. That was one of the conditions. So those were the two options that were presented during for the treaty. But us being Choctaw, we decided to take three options. So some Choctaws did move to Oklahoma as a stand in saying we want to continue our Choctaw life ways. Some Choctaws stayed in Mississippi and became citizens, and some did neither and stayed in the swamps that they knew better than anybody and continued to maintain Choctaw life ways and language in Mississippi. During that removal, as part of the treaty, the United States government agreed to provide guides, like a military guide, and supplies for the journey. Well, as it turns out, the United States government was a terrible travel agent and did not procure a proper amount of supplies. Whether that was intentional or not, that may or may not be up for debate, but there was a large loss of life, especially amongst the elderly and our youth. Our young children weren't able to make the journey. And in Choctaw culture, you know, our elders are our history bearers, our keepers, making sure that we live and maintain our Choctaw ways. And so that did have an effect, you know, in the amount of tribal knowledge and things that weren't able to be transferred after the Trail of Tears. But several about 10,000 people did make the journey successfully to what is now Oklahoma, and quickly reestablished the government. Some of the first things they set up were the schools, again with the missionaries. Our missionaries actually came with us on the Trail of Cheers. Several of them chose to remove with the Choctaw. So we set up our schools and churches, our government. So at the time of the Great Famine in Ireland, we were working on rebuilding our structures. And so when the Quaker Relief Fund made the appeal, here's this experience, I can imagine that the Choctaw people at the time said, oh, an outside entity coming in and, you know, appropriating supplies and moving them out and leaving us with not a whole lot. That story sounds familiar. And so knowing that experience and knowing, I can see that the Choctaws were motivated. There's also, some of the elders have noted at this point, some Choctaws had intermarried with people of Irish ancestry. And so there may have also been that motivation of, we have, you know, family connection through that. One of our chiefs' last name was McCurtain. We have people with the last name Carney, and so we definitely have an Irish presence here in the Choctaw Nation. Also, my mother shared with me, because of this gift, when a lot of people came from Ireland, because Irish are fantastic bearers of history and storytelling, they knew this story. And so they said, well, where do the Choctaw live? We want to live there. They sound like great people. And so we have a lot of people of mixed heritage like myself that include both Choctaw and Irish, because a lot of people moved in and intermarried. So this also, I think, as Ian mentioned, that gift and that connection, we've seen a lot come from that. In 1995, we had a visit from the Irish President Mary Robinson to the Choctaw Nation in acknowledgement of this gift. As Liam mentioned, the Kindred Spirits in Middleton, County Cork. In 2018, we had a visit from the Prime Minister of Ireland to the Choctaw Nation, and he announced the start of a scholarship program. So you have at least one Choctaw person in Ireland right now. And she's the recipient of that scholarship program for graduate work at the University College Cork. So, and most recently, as you may have seen in the news, there were a lot of Irish people out of their generosity donated to our fellow Native Americans of the Navajo, or Dene, as they call themselves, and Hopi tribes. And so this connection, you know, we feel has created a lot of amazing stories that are just continuing. And to get back to Choctaws in Oklahoma, why I live in Oklahoma today instead of the Choctaw, it just being Indian Territory, Choctaw Nation. In Oklahoma, they gave it to the Native Americans. Wasn't prime cropland. There's a lot of rocky soil, perhaps similar. I was able to visit Ireland, the Burns, I believe it's called, around Connemara. I know a lot of Irish people were located there because English didn't think that was great land. And so they said, well, you can have that. So that was kind of the deal with Oklahoma. It wasn't prime farmland. US government didn't think there was a lot going on there until in 1859, oil was discovered in Oklahoma. And so then it suddenly became something the government was a little more interested in. And so there became a move of the United States government on how to acquire Choctaw land in Oklahoma as well. So through a series of acts after the Civil War, eventually the Dawes Commission was set up. And the purpose of this, traditional Choctaw culture, property ownership was very different than European Western tradition, in that the land was tribally owned and used and developed. The Dawes Commission pushed for individual land ownership in what is called allotments. And also the purpose of the allotments is, well, if we give everybody so many acres, so much amount of land, with the leftover land, we can move in more Europeans, which is what happened. So people were offered the opportunity to come sign up with the US government. Come tell us your name, how many people are in your family, how much Choctaw you are, and we'll put you on our rolls. Some people did do this. Some Choctaws had a healthy mistrust of the US government and did not choose to sign up on the rolls. And so there are a lot of people today who have Choctaw ancestry, but because they don't have somebody who signed up on the rules, they can't prove it. So we like to joke as Native Americans, and this is for any Native American in the United States, we have to prove. So I actually have a card here issued by the United States government to prove that I'm Choctaw. This originates is that I had an ancestor that signed up on the Dawes Commission rolls. A lot of people, if you want to join the tribe, you have to be able to trace an ancestor back to that. As they were doing the rolls, they did land allotments, and with the leftover land, they did the Oklahoma land run, in which outside non-native settlers could come in and stake their claim and set up their homesteads. This set up the stage for Oklahoma to become a state instead of tribal lands overseen by sovereign nations. They became part of the United States. And a continued push for assimilation, meaning to set aside traditional native lifeways and become American, whatever that means or that definition. And so we had a series of acts still by the government for the Indian Relocation Act that moved Native Americans from their traditional family units in our rural areas to larger cities, to urban areas. Because of the work of a lot of people for the civil rights movements, a lot of people think of the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King and his work to help empower African Americans, but this also affected Native Americans. So we were experiencing some of the same, not being able to go to schools. We were having some of the same experiences as African Americans, and the civil rights movement led to some acknowledgement of that. So in 1970, we were actually allowed to start electing our chiefs again, some of the tribes in Oklahoma. Today, throughout this, all Choctaw people held on to a lot of their traditional knowledge and language. And so today we still have our language. I have the opportunity to work with a lot of first language speakers. I'm a second language speaker, meaning that I did not grow up in the home speaking Choctaw, but I've gone back to regain that in my family. But I have the opportunity to work with a lot of people whose first language was Choctaw. So we have maintained our cultural values, language, a lot of our traditional knowledge. So we're still here in Oklahoma. We have a lot of businesses that we have set up, and we have a hand in our local communities in promoting education, infrastructure, economic development, mental health programs. that affect not just our tribal members, but our whole communities, which is in line with Choctaw tradition of, you know, it's the community working together that's successful. And so that brings us to today.
Hi, Chantelle. I've a couple of questions coming through here on the chat. Are you okay for those to take those questions now?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ian has been fantastic. He's got low bandwidth, so he's well able to type, and he's been answering a load of questions on the chat already. But there's a couple here that I think would be good to get out there. Is the Choctaw land still owned as a tribe? We are a nation. We would still have evidence of that here in Ireland in communal agricultural land that would be owned by the community. I'm wondering, is that still a feature of what you'd have in the Choctaw?
Yes and no, because of legalities. There's tribal trust land, so land that was purchased by the tribal government after we kind of got the reins back. So again, after statehood, a lot of decisions for the tribe were made by a department of the United States government called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. After the 1970s, we kind of got some of that control back, and we're always, you know, exercising our sovereignty in every area that we can. And so land can be put in tribal trust, and that land is owned by the tribe, falls under federal, like United States government jurisdiction, but not state jurisdiction. So we kind of share that with the federal government.
Okay, that's great. And another one I have coming here, and Ian has answered it, but I think it's a very important point, is what is the level of self-governance of the Choctaw Nation today? So what points do you have autonomy over, and what's your kind of relationship with the greater state departments?
So I think that's a great question. Tribal sovereignty is a fluid issue that we've been trying to figure out for the past 270 years. We actually have some litigation going on right now up to the Supreme Court about the jurisdiction, what falls under tribal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. We do have our own courts. In those courts, people can, especially tribal members living in their tribal areas, can choose to go through that, especially in things of child custody. I know my brother actually went through tribal courts to get his name changed back to our Choctaw family name. There's been a lot of acts over, you know, child care and welfare cases. Tribes exercise a lot of jurisdiction over that, but we actually do have a case in front of the Supreme Court right now that's going to weigh in on that a lot. So we're always pushing to exercise that sovereignty and take that stand anytime we can. Great,
and a lot of similarities with us here in Ireland in terms of self-determination and self-governance, and you're to be commended for that. I have a question in here from Aideen Hassett, and it's a very good one in terms of your origins as a matriarchal society and the impact that the Christian missionaries might have had on that in terms of changing that from your traditional matriarchal society to the more patriarchal European norm. Would you have any insight on that?
I mean, I don't think the missionaries can bear the blame for that alone. I mean, that would have started when intermarriage with Europeans, you know, because the Europeans would have had that patriarchal tradition. And, you know, in Choctaw culture, as Ian mentioned, children were considered part of their mother's clan, kind of last name kind of thing. Whereas in European, Western culture, children last name. But really, the thing that broke down a lot of that was removal and then the land allotments. Because when they did the land allotments, when the government came in, they considered the men the head of the household. And they had, if you wanted land allotment, you had to go through that structure. And I would say that had a huge effect on them. Though we as Choctaw women, we still exercise our traditional rights.
Yeah,
it's just not as publicly evident as maybe before.
Yeah, I think we have some Choctaw relations here in Ireland as well at the moment. So, and you know, it's great to see everyone being treated equally in society at the moment, particularly where we're all faced. So, I will just close out at that, unless I think Ian is probably still, he's doing some great question answering on the chat, and we'll post that in our Facebook later. Chantelle, do you want to say anything else to close out?
I'm just going to invite everybody. I'll do a quick screen share here. If you are interested in, you know, digging deeper, we do have, let's see if I can get this. Here's the Choctaw language website at choctawschool.com. And we have information if you wanted to hear some of the hymns, hear some of our first language speakers. We also have a YouTube channel that kind of highlights some of the things we're doing currently and some of our history. So you can stop in there if you want more. And see if I can say this correctly. In Choctaw, we say Yako Ki, thank you, or Go Rev Ma'agat.
That's fantastic.
Taking an interest in our culture and our life ways. And we're very grateful to still have them and proud to share them. So thank you for joining us and inviting us. And
thank you for taking interest in the Irish nation in 1847 and for making that contribution of $170, which probably doesn't seem massive now, but I've read accounts of the grandchildren of people who were saved by that donation, and it meant a hell of a lot to them. It means a hell of a lot to the Irish people now, and it's great to have this link. It's great to have the Choctaw Nation as a kindred spirit of the Irish nation, and thank you so much for contributing this evening. It's been a privilege having you.
Yakuki.
Slán.
Means Lechki. In Choctaw we say, well, we will see you again. We'll see you in the future.
And we have something similar, we'll say Slán go fóill. So just bye for now. Thanks so much.